Andrew Tate has had his first interview since he's been released from jail. Now, this is with the BBC. They were able to secure the first interview with Andrew Tate. If people don't know who Andrew Tate is, well, they should. He was the most Googled man on the planet for a period of time. And he's out of jail. And what he was predominantly in jail for was the accusation of trafficking of two women, where we now have evidence that they lied about this situation. We see their text. We have video footage. There were no formal charges that Romania, that's the country that he's in right now, Romania had not filed any formal charges. The prosecution had not filed any formal charges against Tate and his brother. Yet they held him there, they detained him there for a period of time. And he was released. He's on house arrest right now. The BBC comes in. Now, keep in mind, this entire footage, if people want to watch it, it's a decent interview, 38 minutes long. The BBC has shrunk it, reduced the time to 12 minutes. So 38 minutes of footage, but now reduced to 12 minutes. Now, if you watch the entire 38 minutes, what you're seeing is that Andrew Tate is more composed, slightly more passionate, a tinge of emotion in there when he fires back at the BBC reporter for not doing her due diligence. And what this BBC reporter really is not an individual who's coming there on mutual ground to have a rational conversation about the accusations, where he is now, what the future is going to be like, but more so she's a representative of BBC, and BBC, British broadcast company. I want to say this. Generally, BBC has good neutral headlines for the most part. Like if you sign up for the breaking news, you get neutral headlines. But BBC, if you dive deeper to the stories, they're actually heavily biased towards people on the left. So they're another institution, part of the general media apparatus. And even though they're not an American company, they're a British company, they're still part of the Western front of the media organizations who align themselves with a certain narrative and a certain ideology. So anytime they put out a piece, anytime they put out a headline and they have someone who's writing an article, or even in this situation, they're having a conversation with Andrew Tate, they're coming with a certain bias. Now, if we're being objective, whether you like Tate or not, whether you like the BBC or not, we should be objective about what the evidence is presented with. What are we seeing? What is the circumstantial evidence and the direct evidence that we have for this situation? A lot of people don't like Tate because of his rhetoric. Okay, you don't have to like someone because of their rhetoric, but that does not fault them to be prosecuted for a crime that they did not commit. Even if you're in another country, a developing nation, we're using the constitutional standard here, there was no evidence. No evidence was presented. No formal charges were presented. A state held, and I don't want to say indefinitely because they released him after a period of time, but from the get-go, it was held and detained indefinitely until they were going to come up with a formal charge. That's not how a justice system operates if you want to live in a society or a civilization that has rule of law. When you have unequal rule of law and you're selectively prosecuting people just because there's a bias, that presents a very clear and present danger for everyone else in the society. You need to have equal laws that are applied equally to everyone, every private citizen. In this situation, Tate, he was speaking out against not just the media, but he was speaking out against a lot of other powers, a lot of other institutions. I will say, Tate is not perfect. There are a lot of things that I could criticize Tate on. For example, he's a four-time world kickboxing champion. If you look into it a little bit more, the leagues that he was competing in were not the extremely top-tier leagues that most people, like if you look at people in the UFC, they have competed in the top leagues of, let's say, kickboxing, and now they're in the UFC. Tate did not compete in the top leagues of kickboxing. He competed in an extremely competitive environment. So you give someone props to that. But Tate is a marketer. He's going to take that. He's going to advance with it. That doesn't mean he's bad at martial arts. He's extremely adept at martial arts compared to 99% of the population, but he's going to upsell it. He's going to market it in a certain way. So there are certain criticisms you can bring about him. He even admits this. He could be more careful with his words now that he is extremely popular. Before, when he wasn't popular and his videos were getting no views, he was saying whatever he wanted to because there was no audience. So he could say something, and the impact, the effect, the potential ramifications were so minuscule at that point. It didn't really matter what he said. Now that people can go back in time, they can look at his clips, they can take it out of context, or they can say it was not satire or not understand that it was satirical and apply it to everyone right now, apply it to the masses, and paint Tate in bad light. That's where the issue is. Now, Tate has said some crazy stuff, but a lot of it has been satirical. Of course, there are certain personal opinions that many people would disagree with, many people would agree with. But the vast majority of what he has done is positive for men, mainly masculinity. In a time where we're seeing LGBT, which is fine, you can be LGBT, but in a time where we're seeing perversion of ideology, especially attracting impressionable minds like young children, people like Tate are necessary. I could put a lot of people in this boat. It's not just Tate, and everyone has a different type of character or classification, right? You can take Patrick Bet-David. You can take Myron Gaines from Fresh and Fit. You could take Andrew Tate. I'm purposely mentioning hot people right now, people that are controversial. A lot of these people, they have gone through trials and tribulations, and they're coming up with certain, first they're looking at objective data, right? There's a lot of statistics and data that people can use to paint the picture of what reality looks like, not just for men and women separately, but also together, although they do cater towards men. So when you have these people who have their own opinions, but they're also looking at objective data, and they've gone through experiences that have made them into certain men of status, wealth, they've developed charisma, they've developed their looks, they've gone to the gym. I mean, there's a wide array of things that men have to do to become, to reach the top heights of society. And a lot of that is looked down upon, especially when you have the rest of society demonizing masculinity, demonizing men for achieving. I know there have been tons of articles that have specifically demonized masculinity, but there have been articles relating fitness and going to the gym, lifting weights, compared to what people in World War II Germany would do, and making that link to display that if you go to the gym and you lift weights, you are essentially akin to the people from World War II Germany. I mean, this is absurd. So when we understand how this media apparatus works and how the people behind the media apparatus work and how they're not there to have an honest conversation with you. This is much bigger than this Tate interview. The media is not there to have an honest conversation with you. They're there to gather perspective, cut and edit clips, create a certain narrative, give it to the masses, and now display to the masses how this character should be demonized. And when you demonize this character, it doesn't have to be Tate. It can be Patrick Bet-David. It can be Myron Gaines. It can be anyone, right? Any type of male masculine figure. You demonize that character, you're essentially demonizing the entire niche of masculinity. And when there's a lack of polarity in society, because you have the masculine, you have the feminine, you're making everything feminine. And what this does, ultimately, is it weakens the population. So now the vast majority of the population are not mentally or physically strong enough to combat, compete, or rebel against the people at the top of the hierarchy. That's what this ultimately comes down to. You have people at the top, and I will say a lot of people at the top, they're not necessarily masculine themselves either. They just have convoluted ideas of how they want to control labor and resources. Essentially, you're controlling society. And they need to ensure that there are obstacles in place to have their agenda fulfilled. If I give a relevant example for people, if you look at, let's say, college universities, and this is just one out of many examples I could use, college universities need to ensure that they collect payment from people. So they'll work with government to create student-backed loans. Now, you as a taxpayer, but also you as a private citizen who decides to go to college, you cannot default on your student loan. You can default on any other kind of loan. You can claim bankruptcy. You can start back at zero and kind of have a fresh experience after 7 to 9 years of going through bankruptcy. But for your student loans, you cannot default. So these universities that are private universities, but now they're linked to the government, they have secured their payments because the government wants to get paid back with their loans. What these institutions also do is they take advantage of inflation. They take advantage of how salaries and wages are not rising up as much as they should be, as much as the expected amount compared to the increase in GDP, the increase in productivity in the economy. And so they jack up their prices because they know they're going to get the money through these secured loans. They jack up their prices, they bloat their administrative costs, and you're getting the same type of, I don't want to say education, you're getting the same type of schooling, but with better amenities because we have an advancement of technology. So you're getting a recreation center, tennis courts, whatever. This does not contribute towards people's education if we're using education in the most traditional sense, right? You're going through schooling to get a certain degree. That degree generally should help you network to get a decent occupation. But now what we're seeing is the democratization of schools, but the government is intervening. And it's not necessarily bad to democratize education. You want to have education be democratized, be accessible to everyone. That's why we have the internet. People can go get textbooks. They can do research online. You have full access to more information than most people have ever had in human history. But schooling is very different. So this institution has to ensure that its interests are met. The same as with all the other institutions that control different parts of society. If you have financial institutions, they have to make sure that their business model is secured. And they have to ensure that their business model is not disrupted in any kind of way. So if there's someone out there who's speaking out or criticizing these different institutions, well, that's now the enemy, that's the target. And they can go to such great lengths where if someone is living in a certain country, and this country is heavily corruptible, they can influence this corruptible country, and they can have someone detained indefinitely for a period of time without evidence. And if you go through the video footage, if you go through all the circumstantial evidence that has debunked the reason why someone was accused, you can see how, okay, maybe this person isn't the best person, right? They don't have a great character. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Let's just say we're going with a general public perception. But the evidence does not substantiate the claims that are being made. And especially when you don't have a formal charge. And then for the BBC to come in and have all this time to do their own due diligence, to do their own research, and still be contentious in a conversation where you're entering someone's home and you're being given exclusive access to an interview. Tate is right in this interview when he says that's extreme. I mean, he doesn't say this overtly. Maybe he had, but his dictation, his behavior shows that, hey, what you're doing is extremely disrespectful. If you want to come here for a conversation, we're going to have a conversation. And Tate understands he has to be more careful with his words, as most people should be, especially in the world that we're living in. But it's such a sad state of reality that we have to be more careful with their words because everyone is more sensitive and people don't like getting offended. When people are afraid to say something because they're afraid of offending someone else, we are now limiting our potential of concepts, ideas, and future progression. Imagine if people were too afraid, and they were afraid, but if people were too afraid to relinquish indentured servitude or slave labor in the past, which, by the way, that's still going on in many parts of the world. But imagine if people are too afraid to talk out against that in the past. Now, people right now may sit and think, well, how would they be against that? How would they say that they don't want to say anything against that because that would hurt someone else's feelings? Well, there have been periods of time where that was a cultural norm and it was normalized. It was not an evil. It was not illegal. It was, everyone was accepting of it. So to speak out against that would produce shame on you. But there have to be people who speak out against atrocities. Now, a lot of times people may speak out against something and it may not be justified, but they still have the right to speak out against it. But imagine if people were not able to speak out against certain atrocities. You are limiting the progression of the human species, right? So people need to have the right to speak out. And if people are going to be offended, if people's feelings are involved, feelings are always involved in situations, that is a risk you have to take to that progression. Not everything you say is going to lead to a progression, but if we're facing indentured servitude, or there are a group of people who are facing slave labor, and we're trying to release them from that, and you're going to speak out against that, even though you acknowledge that 90% of the population or your local society may shame you for that. That's a risk you have to take. And part of that risk is what has happened in this situation, where you have someone who's unlawfully accused, unlawfully detained, and unlawfully put on house arrest. Now, this guy is smart to an extent. He's built up, he's been able to create companies and put them in other names, so he's not directly involved. So yeah, you are giving up some control, but you have other people managing these different entities. He's smart. He's going to have to play the long game here because he's on house arrest. He can't really leave. He's a flight risk. But of course, he's probably thinking of a strategy on a way to get out, to find a place that has more individual rights. Now, America is the best for that. Texas and Florida are the best for that. You do have other places in society that would be relatively safe, although they don't have absolute rights. And even here in America, our absolute rights are being chipped away at every single day. So we have to acknowledge that whenever people go after other people's speech, or they fabricate lies, and these lies go from the court of public opinion culture into policy, and then policy into law enforcement, we are seeing how this trajectory can affect all of us. If people haven't woken up yet, if this can happen to someone who has status, wealth, influence, and resources, which is resources part of wealth, if this can happen to a top tier person, it could happen to you. And if you're not in that position of power, what makes you think you would survive a situation like that? You may think, well, I'm in the state of Texas, I'm safe. I'm in the state of Florida, I'm safe. Right now we're seeing, especially in America, the federal government is going hard against people who do not only can you not be neutral, double negative, but you actually have to align yourself with the federal government and their ideology. And their ideology is reflect reflective of culture. So if you're not aligning yourself with culture and the way culture is moving, even if you are a Christian or you're Muslim or you're Jewish and you have certain beliefs of this is not how we should treat people, this is not how we should treat our young, if you don't align with the ideology of the federal government, they will go after you. The DHS, Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and all these other agencies have come together and they have made it their mission through memorandums, internal memos, but also public statements, that they are going to target specific people, and how they frame it is through emotional manipulation. They will demonize people, they will character assassinate people, and then they will go after them through prosecution. And they know at a certain point they could get away with it because they have enough public sentiment for the rest of the population to say, yeah, it's justified, it's okay. And for the majority of the population to not intervene in that prosecution process. We can take it a step beyond that, but I'll leave it at prosecution. So unlawful prosecution, a lot of people may look at this situation again and say, I don't like this guy. Who cares what happens to him? Good riddance. You need to understand what empathy is. Put yourself in a situation like that. I'm not saying you have to be him. I'm not saying you have to be in his shoes, but put yourself in a situation like that. Change the name Tate with someone else. Nelson Mandela. Change it with someone else. Michael Jackson. Whether you think these people are guilty or not of certain crimes they've been accused of, whether or not there's evidence, whether or not the circumstantial evidence is strong enough, you still need to have those absolute rights to ensure that you're exonerated and the right people are not put in jail for no reason, no good reason. But this just shows how strong the media has a grip on not just Tate, but the perception of people like this. And when we live in a society where masculinity is being attacked more and more, we will ultimately live in a civilization where we're already being subverted. But when you have a weak nation, you have other countries like China and Russia. If we want to say Russia right now, that's the bad guy right now in Western media. But let's look at China. China is the sleeping giant. China is focusing on masculinity. They're not demonizing it. They're focusing on masculinity. They're promoting it on all their apps, on their WeChat, on all their mirroring apps. So like we have TikTok, they have another app like TikTok, but it's called something else there. They're promoting the exact opposite of what America is degrading. In America, when we're degrading masculinity, we're becoming weaker. A lot of people think, well, yeah, but people need to be in touch with their emotions and be softer and be kind to other people and focus on pronouns and focus on feelings, while other nations are getting stronger. And that is not a priority. What is the priority is conquering other nations like America as they get weak, as they become more vulnerable. And China will have ensured that they become the number one superpower. They're already ensuring that they're making the transition to the world reserve currency where the yuan is going to compete or outcompete the US dollar. And you have a ton of other countries that they're aligning with, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They're aligning together to ensure that the America system is no longer the number one system. When people see the bigger picture, they see the macro events of this timeline. We can clearly see how all these little events are contributing to the downfall of the West. This is not something that we should take lightly. I mean, we all live in the West. Most of us live in the West who are watching this video. We want to promote the ideology that made the West the best section of the world that it's been in the past 200-300 years. We're the most prosperous we've ever been. We have the highest standard of living compared to all the other places in the world. People have opportunity here. People can get a job here. People have enough disposable income to actually take some of that disposable income and use it on entertainment and enjoy their life. But people take all that for granted. People don't understand why they're able to do the things that they're able to do every single day, and how that is not even comparable to the vast majority of the population of the world. They don't have the same amenities and affordances and conveniences that we have here in the West, not just in America, but England, Italy, Spain, France. So I say this all the time, but it's extremely important. When we see, look, the media apparatus is extremely vital towards painting the public perception. If there's no accountability, they'll keep doing what they're doing. They'll keep misleading the public. They'll attack other institutions, smaller institutions that are trying to compete with the media apparatus and say that they're the bad guys and they're spreading misinformation, they're spreading disinformation. And by the way, all that is constitutional for a reason of making sure that no one can be exploited. Because you can have a bigger entity, a bigger institution come in and say, well, you're spreading misinformation, we're making it unlawful. And therefore, that person may be actually spilling the truth, but now they're banned, or now they're censored, or they're suppressed, and they can no longer say what they need to say, which would be advantageous for the rest of the population to consume. A lot of things here to consider. This is just one example of, I don't want to say hypocrisy is a good word. Whatever the BBC was accusing Tate of, but not just Tate, other people in general, is exactly what they're doing. And not just BBC, but a lot of other media organizations, a lot of other media institutions, once people start to see what's actually happening behind the scenes. I mean, you can see, this is not even behind the scenes, this is right in front of your eyes. You can see the contention that this reporter had with Tate, and it's not even the person talking to Tate, it's the representative of the organization. And this person, look, at a certain point, this person has to rely on this as a job, so they're doing their job. But that's why we need to start from the top down, because a lot of people at the bottom of the hierarchy, they're just relying on these people at the top to ensure that they have some type of financial security. And for a lot of people, that's where they're hooked.